whether you can see my screen, because I can see you can. So we're all good there. Now, my background then, so just having a, so as you correctly said, I'm a consultant at Neva Limited. I've been a Marketo addict now since 2013. So specifically, my thing is marketing. So I like to know the context behind why I'm doing something, behind the reason you're creating a campaign in a certain way. That's always been my thing. I'm not in favor of just doing stuff because operationally, I want to consider the wider context. And that's always been my bag. So I'd previously worked in Eloqua quite a lot. And then I really committed to Marketo. So previously, I hadn't even been to a Marketo user group until February of this year. So I was new to the community space. I knew it existed, unengaged there, but until I really dived into it, I had never, I'd never seen what's possible, and I've been learning a huge amount from everyone else. So I'm lucky enough to be one of the Marketo champions this year. As you said, Brooke, we've got an EMEA virtual mug that will always continue to be virtual, with our next one really, I think at the first week of September. Yeah, super excited to get going. So the topic that we're actually covering and why we kind of got into this PineSOLVE the data, and also why you see glasses here in front of me, is that I got into a conversation with Andy, and we were going around, okay, maybe we should talk around data normalization. And then it was like, well, how can we make that fun? And Andy said, add alcohol. So that's exactly what I've done here. So that's the reason I've got glasses. I have ingredients. I will be making one, but it's in reference to what is a perfectly balanced data normalization strategy. What is a perfectly balanced database? And that's kind of where I focused it on. So going through the overview topics then is kind of who's your audience. So specifically your stakeholders, your database, and those interactions, considering that context in terms of trying to design or embark on your data normalization strategy. That's really been my area of focus there. And again, it's just simply because my background is, well, actually, what is that context? Who are those people? Who are my audience? I want to know those granular details. I really try and think like that first before I start embarking on something. And it really supports your main stakeholders, which as a whole are marketers. And then you start to add more value to the business by thinking like that. And that's the way that I've always approached everything I do in Marketo. So, and then we've got getting a good base. So that's when I'll select my glass. I've got then what is the request here? What's being asked of me? I've then got the right data ingredients. So a couple of different recommendations on different tools that I've used for data normalization, along with some quick little tips. And then I've got a final part, which is the little garnish on top, the little coffee beans, because I'm going to be making an espresso martini. So I hope that's not a spoiler. With some pro tips, whereas actually I'm going to just dive into Marketo and show you some of the CURL stuff, which I've learned fairly recently, but it is something that I think is absolutely awesome in terms of enhancing some of your smart lists. So that's super cool. I'm literally going to dive into Marketo and show you that. So that's our topics for today. And of course, there'll be any questions you want to ask, I'm happy to answer. But again, I'm not super technical, but I do think context. So getting started, and you'll notice I've even corrected the spelling to the American spelling there for you guys, because normally we use the S, but hey, that's a whole new thing. So what is data normalization? In a nutshell, all it really is doing it well makes your data usable. You can really only use some of the advanced features really fully in Marketo if you get this bit right. I can't emphasize that enough. I think when you have a really messy database, aside for just having resource dedicated to cleaning stuff up or going down black holes of databases. There's no value add really in getting too far with that. However, what I would say, if you've inherited an instance, you might not have that choice, but I'll dive further on because I've got a couple of checklists, things like that. So who's your audience? And I've got 3 different segments here. I've got knowing your database. So that's just literally what data have I got in my database. Knowing your stakeholder. So what's been asked of you. And it's often one that people forget, but it's still equally as important. In particular, reference to data normalization and how you approach it. And then also we have know your database behavior. So there's a subtle difference there between knowing your database and the different behavior, because it's almost like expected behavior versus what people are actually doing. And that's what I'm going to touch on as well. And all of this helps. All of this is going to help form that strategy. So know your audience then. So someone has made a request for me. So I've got these glasses here. I'm going to select the right drink. But before I get started on that, I need to know who they are. So I really think about here what data we have on those individuals. Is there data that's going to enable me to get more data? Is that data of value? What does my database structure? And it's a wider question, a wider discussion with your team, but it's an important consideration there before you start embarking on data normalization. And then we have like, well, how are they behaving? So are they converting on forms, and why and where from? What are they doing and converting? What are the timings of clicking and converting on average? So all those little details builds up this mental picture of who your database is. And I think that's super important. And again, it's just important to really consider the context of which you're going to approach this. So do they engage with a lot with ungated content? Is your chatbot converting well? All the little things there I'm going to consider. And that is something that I'll touch on in a second. Knowing your stakeholder. Again, I said that one of these things is, are your stakeholders engaging in the same way? So are your salespeople picking up the phone and asking for the same people? Are they requesting a certain segment? How is that split? Are they split by industries? Know your stakeholder as well as you know your database, because that will define how you approach everything, and whether you choose to be a blocker or whether you choose to go, right, I can pinpoint the exact value that I'm adding to the business. So knowing your audience, so particularly here, I've got examples here of stakeholder engagement, so requests that have come to me. So what I largely get stuff for campaign work, things like that. But these are just some of the examples that I've had when people have come to me with kind of requests of different campaigns and stuff like that. I'm like, who do you want to speak to? What are you trying to achieve? Like, let's reel it right back. And some of these examples are like, hey, I want to target senior IT leadership of certain industries. And so if you look at it from normalization, I can already see, well, can I target senior? Can I identify senior leadership within there? What makes up a senior leadership? Like, what are the expected behaviors of senior leadership? Because obviously within different companies, there's going to be budget holders, there's different like mechanisms going on there. So it's really important to define what is senior within this specific example, and trying to identify that within your database. And if the answer is you can't really get there, it opens up the opportunity to do so, because by doing so, and especially if it's a repeatable campaign, something you can use time and time again, you're going to enable that stakeholder. And I just think that's so important. You've got IT leadership. So IT is an interesting one. Those of you who have looked at job title contains IT will have had fun with that. I've got a solution for that coming up. and then certain industries. What are my top industries? How can I rank them? Am I writing different content? What's important to those industries? You see how all that context starts to come together around then how you start to look at industries. So where's your data coming from? So this is, I mean, super important, and you'll know from lots of you that have got slightly bigger instances, you've got various different APIs, you've got different forms, you've got social media going in. All of this is pointing towards your Marketo, and you've got to sort that out. You've got to form the line, so to speak. So before I can make or answer the request of what drink would you like, or how would you like to shape up your database, or here's my recommended drink database, I need to be able to figure out audience, stakeholders, and where they're coming from, and everything around that as well. And it can be a wider question, a wider discussion, especially if you're inheriting a Marketo database and it's so messy. There is discussions that can be had from team members that are going to form your hypothesis for how you approach it. So this is my checklist then. So this is something I use for if I'm starting that conversation, and something that people on the back of this Q&A can disagree with, can ask questions of, query my spelling, which is not my strongest point. Whatever you want to do on the back of the Q&A, we can look at this. So I look at, can I find my primary audience? Like that should be question one. Are my primary audience there, and can I identify them? Can I target them? Where are the primary audience likely to come from? So looking at the different sources, where are my audience, like where are my primary target audience coming from? And again, you can obviously break this down into primary, secondary, product type, but as a whole, I found something like a checklist before embarking on a data normalization strategy to be quite useful. Are there any fields or gaps in my data I could really use? Which is an easier question to ask as opposed to what fields have I got? Because how do you know then what to target, how to get that data? And that's the reason I've got that in my checklist, because it justifies why you're doing it. Like, can you write a different message? Are you going to provide more value by getting that data? Are my stakeholders looking for the same target? So I touched on this just in a couple of slides ago, but I just cannot emphasize that you should be completely lined up, even if it means just going on the back of this, just slacking someone who you know and stakeholders, go, hey, when you phone someone, how do you go and do it? Like, what do you do? Can you talk me through that? And you can do that as an operations person. There's nothing stopping you. It's super important to understand that process just as well as you understand the campaign process. Because if you guys are in operations, marketing operations, you're the one responsible for lining up and joining up that process, in my view. Obviously, there's some variances in there, but it's still an important question. And then, are my target accounts easy to identify? So those of you who use kind of that mechanism, can I find them? So in a specific example, I want to target Toyota, for example. If I've got Toyota Inc., I've got variants in within there, I've got different variances coming in all the time. Let's try and think, well, is it easy to target? And I would give that a rank of 1 to 10. And that's going to help really go, well, where do I now go with this target? If I'm going to look at data normalization for target accounts, how important is that to me? And then also we've got how confident am I, a scale of 1 to 10 to target my primary audience. So this is slightly different to, can I find them? Yes, you can find them, but are you confident that you're speaking to the right people? Those people have engaged recently, and my message is going to get through. That's what I mean by that one. And then we've got things like, what data sources are the least effective in providing me reliable data? Reliable being the important word there. So and not to call anything out, but if I'm going to buy alcohol and I'm going to buy vodka from a guy in the back of the van, I'm not going to chug that. And that's the same thing going on here, right? It's going to be a case of, I'm going to just buy random data, and we don't do this so much in EMEA, I guess, because of the whole GDPR thing. So it's super important for us to ask that question. And also, it's like, are you just fishing within this giant pond and hope that someone's going to bite? Like, yeah, really consider your data sources and what are the least effective of providing you reliable data, because that will help define it. There's no point normalizing data that actually doesn't even give you anything or you get no bites on. It's a waste of effort, it's a waste of money, and that's my view. So I think I'm ready to serve. So I know my audience. I'm choosing my glass, ready to go with this one. So knowing those things is going to help. So getting a good base. Now, I use segmentation to normalize a lot, and why I do that is because I really think about how would I write a different message to a different audience. And yes, it's a little more trickier to edit, but here are some of the examples that I use to segment on. So the standard one is geographic segmentation, which is fine. They can't be in the same segment, so it's very much a case of, okay, I'm using it to organize. There is one caveat here where I've got language and country. If you're using dynamic content on an email and you've got two pieces of dynamic content there, so you've got language and then say the call to action is button, and you've got things like country, you can get caught out by, and I would never recommend using, unless you're entirely confident there's no overlap, I would never recommend using two different dynamic segments on an email. For that very reason, data is not 100% reliable. And if you want to put your hand up on the Q&A, let's have that discussion, because it's an interesting area. Seniority. So this is one where you start to think around, and it does go into that whole job title, job function debate that I'd sort of just get into in a little bit. And that's really a case of, can I target the decision makers? Should I exclude decision makers from this example? So specific things are certain job titles lend itself more to seniority. So examples are things like director, VP, executive. You can get around the whole marketing exec thing, and I'll show you a little bit in a sec. But those are going to lend yourself to seniority. And by doing it in segments, it's going to allow you to normalize and use it. And a lot of the companies I work with don't tend to use dynamic content, and it becomes that learning process as, let's make it easy for you to write to them differently. And it's like, hey, I'm not going to say, would you buy a pair of glasses if I know they don't wear glasses? Do you know what I mean? It just seems illogical. So you can normalize and use it. And I kind of play around with segmentation a lot. I do lots of experimentation there. Some persona-based ones. So if you've got lead scoring models, this can fit into it. So I know what some of you are thinking already. You can't use smart lists, so member of smart lists within segmentation. You can get around that. You can have members of lists within segmentation, and you can have a smart campaign that adds them to list. So that's how I get around it with some of the persona-based stuff. So for things like product type, as an example, so there's 3 different products. I want to track their engagements with certain tagged content or certain emails that lend itself to product group 1. Once I identify that actually there's a grouping there that are more interested in product group 1, I'm going to use that in then segmentation, and then I can speak to those differently dynamically as well. There's a whole other topic there into dynamic content, which I'm not even going to scratch the surface of. You can go into the whole dynamic contents in snippets. There's a huge variety of stuff to just play around with, break, experiment with, just go nuts on it. Because if you don't really approach normalization with Am I going to use it? What's the point of normalizing it anyway? So that's always been my view. Restricting data updates. So I still think this is a underused feature of Marketo, is blocking field updates and from certain input sources. So if I want to control the data in Marketo, I want to be the one to do that. And so I'll always look to go, well, okay, if you're doing list imports and we've got some dirty data, this is almost the first thing I'll check and about those block imports. An important highlight as well is that the web service API, if you block updates to data from that, the API will still work as a whole. I obviously can't speak for every single API, but when I've tried it multiple different times, when I block that update, it just stops it updating the data, particularly if you know that they filled in a form recently. I'm skeptical of lots of input sources into Marketo, because it just makes it harder to just figure out, especially if all you're updating is capitalization and things like that. So just have a play around and really focus on, like, what can you block there that's going to give you some dirty data. So form strategy, again, just touching on this, but for the purposes of data normalization. So we've had some recent updates in June where you've got the program level data fields. Now I've already tried to play around, break that, see what anything's been missed. So to be clear here, you can't use that in tokens. You can't use that in reporting unless it's the membership list of the campaign. You only get 20 program data fields for your entire Marketo instance, and that then goes across each of your every single one of your programs. So an example use case that I've found is if you were to include something like dietary requirements for one particular event that's central, well, for one particular program, that's somewhere to do it. You can export it, but you can't really use program level data fields in any meaningful way yet, other than smart lists. That's it. So that's my findings, but I still recommend, even knowing that, I still recommend a centralized form strategy, and it's really going to allow you to test and learn here. And it's something that's sometimes forgotten about in terms of split testing. Lots of people do split testing within emails, but split testing with a kind of order of different fields, what's going to aid more conversions there. Now, obviously, you'll need more conversions for it to be statistically valid, but I still always play around with just testing on the forms. As a whole, if you were to take a blanket approach, ideally, you could avoid free text fields. I realize in some cases it's inevitable. If I had it my way, I would even remove forms entirely and just give people access to content, let them reveal themselves, make it accessible, help them learn and engage, start recognizing early signs of engagement. But that's my opinion. I take a more radical approach of, in nowadays, you don't need to gate a white paper or that's like massively useful to the stakeholder. If you go back to that image of the bouncer, that's what I'm doing. Like, that's my view. Again, there could be some interesting things in the Q&A here. If you have a drop down, consider the logical order there. Like, I've been on so many forms where you go, okay, cool, country, okay, first one, Afghanistan, all right, I'm going to scroll down and find UK. No, if you want to target particular types of countries, or there's even certain countries that you might even not be allowed to do business for, consider the order of that drop down. So then what you're doing is you're looking at, yes, I'm going to normalize the input method, but also I'm going to make it easy. And that's when I talk about balance there. So that's when I start to add things to my cocktail that start to make it a little bit more interesting. So just adding in elements there that are literally going to make it so that I get a relevant conversion rate, but also my data is normalized. I have seen discussions, and I've seen people use autofills. So Google Places API, the code is on this slide deck if that's shared afterwards. So Google's gone off just as I said that. So use of Google Places API, so the form fill one. So why I'm in two minds about this and where it's relevant to consider whether you should use this or not is, like, say for example I put in IBM. Now if I'm going to do that, it gives me IBM UK, IBM United Kingdom. Some of the addresses are messed up. Now if it's very easy for people to get what they want because you're blocking it, i.e. your white paper, am I just not going to tick the right one that sort of matches? Then you've sort of done yourself a disservice really by including that. So I'm in two minds really around that. It's certainly consider the behavior and see if you see any usual behavior there, but that's certainly an area I'd look at. Job title versus job function. Now this is an interesting one really, because if you need sub-segments within that job function, then it starts off this whole can of worms going, well, okay, should we have job function in the form or should we have job title? It's job title for me holds a lot of value, not normalizing that. And what I mean by that is I'm considering that stakeholder on the phone who's going to go, right, I see that Salesforce record. I'm going to ring up, I'm going to ask for this guy. Now, I would still keep job title in there, but I would use it to infer job function. So there's going to be certain job titles that are going to match senior levels or senior stakeholders. So I would use smart campaigns there to go, okay, if they match this job title, then I'm going to match it to that job function. Now, there's a whole other discussion there, hence including this image, right? It just ends up with fights. Well, I say fights in the corporate world of, hey, I disagree with you, so now it's just going to prolong the whole discussion, and then it might not ever happen. So that's an entirely different discussion, but it's certainly look at those two elements hand in hand and consider the uses of them, because job title not being normalized, in my view, still add value. Junk data is a different matter there, where people just type random stuff. There are certain rules there you can do and look for, and you will see. And this is that process that I highlighted at the beginning of understanding your database and just taking time, whether it's once a month, to just go, right, I'm going to export all of my job titles and I'm just going to do a pivot table. Let's see what we've got and how bad the data is, and is it getting worse? And then you kind of go, from what source? Now that practice will enable you to go, I recognize there is a problem. So if it ever comes up in discussion, you can quote numbers. Oh yeah, we have, so I've come across an instance where they had 32,000 different job titles, and 12,000 of those were all different X, Y, Zs and Zs. And then we were able to go, well, hang on a sec, that's a cause of an API thing that had gone horribly wrong. Let's fix it. So there is a practice of just regularly just taking a look there. So the right ingredients. So I've already starting adding ingredients into my little cocktail going on here, and it's I'm going to start to talk around, well, what are some of my little tips, some of my little things that I've been thinking around. Like starting off then, dedupe. It's a pain in the ass for absolutely everyone. I can't think of anyone that's been able to use not duping data effectively. So again, open to any argument, discussion here, but my thoughts are find a way to automate that dedupe and just get rid of it. So things like tools like Ringlead, many of you be familiar with. From my experience, there's a strong learning curve and there's multiple different avenues. It's almost a full-time job maintaining that Ringlead, Ringlead instance that you have, and connecting it up and writing the rules, validating the rules and testing it. There's one also that's local to the UK that had been built from the back of that it's the strong learning curve with Ringlead, and that's called arrow merge. So I'd just like to get out some of those recommendations, and they are essentially engines to dedupe your system. And what that's going to do is make it easier to work with your database. An example would be if you've got two different smart lists, two different opt-ins, different preferences for different ones, it's just going to cause a bit of a world of pain. I've never seen anyone that's gone, hey, yeah, I love dupes. Like, that just doesn't happen. Like, at least I haven't met that person. Like, literally put your hand up if you're that person. I would love to have a discussion about why that is. Always interested in learning new things. So fixing bad emails. So like emails as a whole, at least the first time round, you get form conversions or things that go in. The exceptions to that are things like the LinkedIn form fields that can auto-populate, but you might have the tendency to put work email in there because you don't want it to fill in Gmails and stuff like that. But it will largely always be free text. Now, I have a couple of ways that I use to sort of validate that, and I take a more radical approach here. So the first thing, just the first call out is SIFROC is a great tool, and validating some of those bounce backs and collecting, particularly on some of the more premium tiers, you can really enhance your database from the information that's provided in an autoresponder. So it's not as expensive as like a Drift, but even though Drift now own it, it's slightly cheaper there. But I know the more premium tiers go up a little bit as well, but a recommendation there for SIFROC. And then also we have, what I try and do is when someone fills in something or someone signs up for anything, I know obviously best practice is to send confirmation emails, but think about the wording of those confirmation emails, because what you'll find is that no one really owns those confirmation emails, which is a really weird one, because it's like, well, if I can get people to immediately when they're engaged, validate who they are. So an autoresponder saying, hey, we're going to send you some stuff, but what would you like to hear from us? Hey, it's really great for you to be part of our database, or we're going to email you some stuff, but you just need to tell us what. So you can play around with it, because what you can do on the back of that, on the back of a highly engaged audience, is you're doing two things. So the first thing is you're validating their email is correct. You're sending them an email, a bit hard bounce, you know, you go, well, okay, they've just put in a fake email. In the timing of that, you can use it to point people towards social media channels in that confirmation channel. So driving traffic in other areas is not a bad thing. You can also allow them to choose a preference. So we have GDPR here, like it's very, very strict. A lot of you would have heard about that. You've got the California regulations. I think 4 more states are following suit on that. So you've got to validate that email and validate that someone signed up. It's an extra level of security. I think the only difference between CCPA and GDPR is the difference in what defines as personal data. But it is interesting to go, well, actually, if you're going to come into my database, I'm going to ask you what for. I want to provide you the context of how I'm going to email you. And by doing so, and when I've implemented that method, I've certainly seen an increase in, and specifically, we split the database right down the middle and go, right, here's how we're going to treat confirmation emails now. And I've seen an uplift on how they start to engage with other content, particularly ones that they've selected a preference for, upwards of like 20% click-through rates. Like it's quite extreme once you start to do that. So if you can find someone that owns this elusive confirmation email, maybe it's MOPS, maybe you need to run it by product. It's an opportunity to validate and select a preference there, and it will pay dividends to your business that you're serving. So just to highlight that. So fixing target accounts. So on this element then, I'm a big fan of just going, well, what target company is going to add the most value to who we're trying to speak to? Now, it's a fairly simple question, but that's when you start to getting this whole debate of autocomplete forms, things like that. You kind of go, well, if I'm targeting an account, so I'm going to create a smart campaign. It's worth my time to basically tidy up those company names. So example would be things like, I want to target Toyota. I've got Toyota Inc. I've got Toyota Japan. I'm going to create a smart campaign, so at least then I can target them effectively. It's worth my time doing that because it's going to create more money for your business. Like, that's what we're trying to do as marketers, is provide value to the business so there's a natural progression and hopefully they're going to buy something. And remembering that context as a whole is super important. And yes, your stakeholders will thank you. And yes, as MOPS people, you should make that known, because I've seen a worrying trend of layoffs of different types where the only reason that could be is someone senior has not seen the value in what you guys do and what you guys offer. So make it known that you're doing this so we can speak to them better. You know, there's a whole thing to be said there around how can you make your achievements known, and maybe that's a topic for another time, but yeah, just wanted to highlight that. So it's worth my time fixing target accounts, even though it's a little bit of effort figuring out, well, how are they getting in, where they're coming from, what do I need to sort for specific companies. It's worth my time. So yeah, so I'm just going to finish my little ingredients there. I'm going to pop in a little bit of, hopefully it doesn't go anywhere. Finishing that off. Now we're going to get some fancy with some pro tips here. So looking at the pro tips thing, so this is something I learnt recently actually, and props to Simran, because if it hadn't been from his blog posts, and Simran from Revenue Pulse, by the way, I wouldn't have learnt this. But I'm actually going to just dive straight into Marketo for you now. When that loads, so I'm going to go into there we go. So I'm in Marketo. And what I'm going to try and do here is, this is the C URL. And you'll notice here that I've got my job title contains IT. I put that in 3 times. But notice how there's a little space here and spaces in between. So normally Marketo doesn't let you do this, but there's a little hack, and it's called CURL. It's something I'm fairly new to, and I've only tested a couple of times, but I'm seeing more and more use cases. Now, what this will do is that when you literally, when I talked to before about job title contains IT, and you've got all sorts of things being brought up, which is enterprise, because it's got I and a T in it. You've got director, I and a T, and it goes, well, okay, that's close enough. And you tend to see that happen a lot. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just start this again to see. So I'm going to do job title contains. And when I select this, I'm going to open up, I'm going to inspect on here, and I'm also going to go open up the network. And once I do that and type those things in, so I'm going to put space after, space before, space IT, and then space. And then I'm going to submit that, if I can make my screen big enough. So, 1 second. So when I submit that, I'm going to go to the network tab, by the way. I'll submit that, and I'm going to see here this edit smart list. So I'm going to copy out that. This is super cool. When I first saw this as a Marketo person, I was like, oh my God. But copy out the CURL, and I'm going to paste this into a text field here. Now I'm going to search for these specific values. So so someone else will be able to speak for this, but there's certain language associated with spaces, etc. Like, so I'm going to search here for those IT values that are going to pop up in my CURL. And now I'm going to use the common language and put the space beforehand. So I'll find those one again. I'm going to put a space afterwards. So what I'm doing here is I'm putting %20, which is the space here, and then also a space before and after. So, and then do that. Now, once I have done that, I'm going to open up Terminal. So you'll have this as the Windows process, if you have Terminal as well. And I'm actually just going to paste that in there. What that will do when I get the validation is that that will now put in those spaces. And there you go. So you've got now something that's going to search for correctly the only IT people. So director of IT or IT exec. It's not going to pull up all those additional ones. So to give you an example of how effective this can be, is that we had a segmentation of 72K for IT people. When I implemented this method, it went down to 21K and we could confirm they were all IT people. So it's a really nice hack and something that I'm still playing around with and different use cases just because I think it's super cool and super useful. So back to my slide. And feel free to ask any questions on that. Again, it's kind of new to it, and shouts out to Simran again from Revenue Pulse. And then finally, what Marketo doesn't tell you. I make requests to support all the time. I'm not ashamed of that. And the reason that is because I always wonder what they can actually do. So here's some of the things that Marketo do that possibly you may or may not have known. So they can delete fields. So before you've been on hidden fields, if you give Marketo a list of fields you want to delete, they can delete that. You can contact support. They can create fields at a company level, whereas obviously you can't. They have access to do that. An interesting one that came up that I've seen recently is they can merge Marketo fields with their SFDC fields. So if you're about to do a Salesforce migration, it's worth finding out there around, well, okay, what do we need to merge? It just saves those duplicate fields where you go, well, okay, that's the Marketo one and that's the Salesforce one. I need to play around there. So that is everything in my little pro tips. So those are at least my coolest tips. At least, well, I think they're cool, especially the CRL, but definitely wanted to share that with you. Now, data normalization then in a review. Know your campaigns, stakeholder needs, your database behavior. Essentially get a proper brief and don't be afraid to just reach out. If you're going to take one thing from this, make an effort to just reach out to a stakeholder that you don't normally reach out to and just learn about their process. Because as a MOPS person, you can often get lost in what you're trying to do from the day to day. And if you're going to have a conversation with someone anyway, or you're waiting for a meeting, just reach out, just slack them out the blue. There's no harm in it. I've done it before, but then I possibly don't have any shame in just going and reaching out there. Form over function. It's a fine balance. I will make the cocktail, but I'm acutely aware that when I do that, it will make a massive loud sound and shake up, and my ice has probably melted. But it is a fine balance. It's to consider form over function, or the balance of that. Because if you create something that's too rigid, too fixed, that gives you very good data, you're going to lose the value that that brings. And as a MOPS person, and I've seen that time and time again, where there is arguments like, hey, we can put a fancy white paper there, but is it going to add value? Well, it's going to detract from the value. Yes, that's what. So it's all about balance. Engage Marketo support to help with fields. Like, I think once you start to get Marketo, you don't ask Marketo support enough. I ask them loads of random questions just because I can, and just because that feature's there. So don't be afraid to ask them, particularly when it comes to fields. They can do some more cool stuff than we can. And then look into CRL. It's pretty cool. It's a nice way to play around there. So thank you very much. Yeah, any questions at all? Please shout.
Oh man, Warren, this is great. I really appreciate this. I like I love the content. I love going into CURL and doing the inspect command. I'd love to know more about that Google Places API command inside of your forms, and then if you have latency that comes in from the API, if there's a delay from the response for whatever reason, if that's processing in the Marketo data center or processing across the Google Cloud platform. Um, can you talk a little bit about how you're grabbing that data and then putting that in your form, and sort of what you have for kind of error processing, or what I mean, like if that data doesn't come back directly from the from any of those different elements, how do you handle that on the form fill in your Marketo instance?
So the way that I handle that, and I've seen this a couple of different websites where they have a lot of processes going on, that latency there can be quite slow. So how I deal with that is I go, well, actually, is it going to offer as much value as we think, and reassess that value if it starts to sort of, and again, not speaking as super techie, the latency, I go, well, I reassess the value there if it's a slow site. The other thing is with the exceptions is that you can just type it in. If there is a latency, someone will just type it in. So if I'm going to put in Neva Limited, I'm going to type it in, and largely as a whole, it's not going to pull it up from Google Places. Now, where I do see there is an error is when you've got bigger corporations, because it often gets the addresses wrong. So that's why I'm a little bit skeptical, and it's definitely a case-by-case basis in understanding your audience before you actually embark on that. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it definitely does. So like back in the 90s and the early 2000s, that was always a thing. If you used AOL as your provider, that all of your IP addresses would kind of match to their one centralized spot in North America, and it'd be hard to
Yeah.
get a value back. But so just to make sure I understand, then you're saying that you do the fill not on a select field in your form in Marketo, you're doing it on a text field, so they have that option to type it in.
Yeah, because once you do that, and you'll notice, and I'll send you the link with the specific code that you implement. Once you start typing, it will start thinking and start loading that. So if you type really fast, then you're going to put it in anyway. So, but if you type slowly, then it's going to, or you're thinking about it, am I IBM UK or am I IBM Netherlands? Then it's going to preload it. So there's not necessarily a bad thing there. The thing that I don't like is the ease of doing it, because once you have a non-commitment, because it's easy to fill out that form, then it's kind of going to invalidate, well, okay, I'm probably close enough, IBM, close enough address, I don't care. Now you've lost that value.
Mm, that's good.
I saw a question as well around CURL again. I'm just going to go into that. So let me present my screen. And definitely feel free to ask on the back of that. I am in the Marketing Ops Pro Slack channel as well from Etimo, so happy to send you the actual blog post that I learnt it from Simran, that has a really good guide. That's why I'm calling them out. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start a fresh. I'm going to put in my job title, get rid of that, put it in, drag it over, change that to contains. I'm going to click on the plus. I'm going to put space IT, because Marketo doesn't let you do this in spaces. And then I'm going to do IT space, and then I'm going to do space IT space. And now what I'm going to do is, and I'm going to inspect here. I'm going to go to network. So let me, I always forget to move that up. Inspect here. Then I'll go to network. And then as I click OK, it's got this, you'll see this pop up within the network. I'm going to right click on this, copy, and copy it as CURL. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to paste that into a text editor, and I'm going to find those values that I put in there, and it will be near the top here. And then basically %20 is a space. I forget the language, it's always on the tip of my tongue. you write in, someone else will be able to answer.
HTML
Sure.
coding.
Yeah, that. Then you can then add your spaces in here. And once you do that, copy that out, open up the terminal and paste that, and that will then save your smart list configurations with the spaces. And now automatically you've created somewhere. However, I should add the caveat of ours. If you then open it up again and go to edit it and do it within Marketo, you'll lose that. Hope that helps.
And I just posted that blog post in the chat. So if you're interested in taking a look at that, it should be available there.
Yeah, I've done loads of kind of playing around with it and testing. I love it. Like since I saw that and since I saw Simran posted that, it's yeah, it's a game changer, I think.
Andy, can I ask you this? I don't, and Warren, if you get the answer to that, that's cool too. But just wondering then, so when you save that, is the output of that then like an endpoint that you can use a URL command to give you the response? What you're getting out of that is basically all of the Marketo database records that match the criteria for that smart list. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. So you're actually able to get anything that has IT space after, space IT, space on either side, bookending. So this was originally used for a segmentation with one of our clients. Simran and I worked on this together, and he came back with this brilliant solution to something that just he's one of our technical consultants. So it just addresses so many issues. We were building a very large segmentation with a lot of different titles in it, and then using that to backfill in 3 different field values. And, you know, this methodology just simplifies so much. You don't have to have the, you know, contains IT, but is not architect, or try to think through all those different words that might be a possibility. This just nips that right in the bud from the beginning.
Nice. So the response back off of that URL command, then, are you getting like a JSON or an XML response that you're getting? Like if you have 2 Marketo instances going, can you use this URL command inside of, let's say, like an API developer, like a Postmaster, to be able to kind of take that data and put it other places inside of your tech stack? Is that the response back that you get from that command?
That's an interesting use case. We haven't played around with that, but it would be worth exploring.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think back to like an old Mike Madden webinar on how to use Marketo in like a federated instance where you're dealing with really large enterprises where they have, you know, 6 or 7 different Marketo instances for different parts of their enterprise. Let's say they have different CRMs, and he would say that you would pass leads back and forth by using webhooks between your Marketo instances. So it kind of sounds like this would be a good prerequisite to being able to do that in a much more kind of thoughtful way around different criteria for that specific Marketo instance.
In that instance, I've used something called tray.io. So the use case here was that we had Mailjet and Marketo operating at the same time. They didn't want to pay for all the records in Marketo, so they opened up Mailjet. But one of the things they did want is that they want unsubscribes. If someone unsubscribed from Mailjet, then they also want that to reflect in Marketo and vice versa. And we use tray.io to really, I guess it's API for people that I guess they're not as good as API for me. Then I use that to pass over unsubscribes because there's integrations with Mailjet and Marketo, and that's how we operated it. And it's fairly, it's not super complex. There is a learning curve, but it's worth checking out if you have like use cases like that, because they'll be able to either answer you and you'll be able to fish for information about how you do it, or they'll give you a price that you're happy with.